You're listening to the Be Better Off Show by Kelly+Partners.
Well, good morning and welcome to the Be Better Off Show by Kelly+Partners, where we bring you guests who will help you be healthier, wealthier, wiser, or at least one of those things. And I'm very excited today to have Andrew Davies, the CEO of B Lab Australia in New Zealand, with us. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Brett. It's great to be here.
Mate, I really appreciate you making the time this morning. Just for our listeners, you know, we've got Andrew up extra early today to get on this, and I really appreciate that on a Friday. We do these on a Friday morning. Why don't we start at the beginning? It's always a good place to start. Where did you grow up? Do you have brothers and sisters? And what was your sort of educational journey through school?
Sure. So I had an early stint of my life in Singapore, which was for 6 or 7 years, which is a pretty fantastic place to grow up as a kid. But we came back to Australia when I was in early primary school and grew up a pretty happy, safe, middle-class life in the suburbs of Melbourne, going to school, and then ultimately ended up going to Melbourne University, where I did a law degree and a commerce degree. I was a pretty driven student at school. I was I think I'd like to say that I wasn't the smartest kid, but I knew how to play the system well. I knew how to sit an exam and that sort of thing. So I did all right in school and got into good uni, but it was a pretty safe and happy existence, to be honest, Brett. It was an uneventful life at that stage.
So you go to Melbourne University. That's a bastion of good middle-class conservative values. How was the transition for you from school into, a big, wild university of real diversity and different people from all sorts of backgrounds?
Oh, look, I think it was a brilliant experience, Brett. I was a middling student at that stage. I suddenly found myself surrounded by some very, very clever people who were thinking much bigger thoughts than I was. So I probably took a pretty safe journey through uni, where it was as much about kind of the social experience as it was academically. But like a lot of students, I think in my last couple of years of uni, I suddenly realised that what an incredible opportunity it was to actually learn something and get perspective from, as you say, a wider cohort of people, a more diverse cohort. So I just had an absolute ball. I stretched it out as long as I could by going the slow road. And then reality set in sort of after 5 or 6 years of uni. It was time to go get a job. And that's when I really started off a career in the law.
So you go to look for a job. What did you learn in your career in your university studies that pointed you to what type of law job you should get?
Yeah, I think that at that stage I was thinking quite traditionally in terms of career. So I went into one of the big Australian commercial law firms. I was certainly always interested in business and economics at that stage, so I was doing a commerce degree on the side. I wasn't particularly connected to higher causes, but equally I found a lot of interest and joy in how the economy worked and how business worked. So it was a pretty natural step, but also, let's be honest, a very safe and traditional step to go into one of those graduate jobs in a corporate law firm, although it was also a pretty brutal step. You certainly cut your teeth working some very heavy hours. That professional services environment can be pretty challenging, and this was a few years ago, perhaps, when those firms weren't as well known as they are now for looking after people. So look, I wouldn't say I was inspired by a particular career choice. I was making choices that I thought would put me in a good position for later opportunities, which certainly I think proved to be the case.
So it's very interesting. And, we run a professional services firm and you do want to look after people. I think the inherent challenges, you sort of hire A-type personalities. They don't like finishing work at 5:30, even if you encourage them to do that. They're very committed to themselves, their career and their clients. Now, today, there's obviously a lot more, push for better work-life balance and more concern for people to make sure they're okay. What do you see now? Like I was at Pricewaterhouse at 18. I always felt that, university teaches you something, but a good workplace can teach you how to work, which is a rare education. I value the fact that I had to work so hard because I felt it showed me what I was capable of that I wouldn't have otherwise necessarily known. How do you balance that sort of mindset with with today's, concern for people's well-being?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, Brett. And I think that the contemporary professional services firms that we see are very different organisations than they were 20 years ago when I was sort of starting out. And I think the key concept is that it's okay to be driven. It's okay to want to work hard. And as an organisation, the real skill is in harnessing that energy and helping people not just work hard for the firm, but work hard for themselves and improve themselves. And I think that's the key change. It used to amaze me. I moved into corporate roles after a few years, and looking back at them, I thought, wow, these law firms or accounting firms or management consultants, they all have the same thing. They have these incredibly driven people coming out of university who want to, as you say, they want to work hard, they want to learn. And you do learn so much on the job. They're great places to really expand your horizons. But I think that the firms do think a lot more carefully now about how they can craft people for the long term and craft careers. I mean, the other challenge was that back then there was really only one career path in these firms. It was climb the ladder to get to partner. And if that wasn't your aspiration, you were going to be, giving a pound of flesh for not much good reason. So I think that the firms do a much better job now of trying to craft pathways for people, recognising that not everyone's going to end up as a partner or a senior manager or a director, whatever the terminology is, but you can learn a heck of a lot on the way and you can open some pretty incredible doors. I mean, it's a very privileged existence early in your career to be kind of working with high-level business people, working sometimes across the globe even. I remember at this ridiculous stage where I was in Hong Kong working on a sort of M&A transaction. There's about a 26-year-old, I think, working crazy hours, but living this existence that I couldn't even have fathomed in any other pathway. And yes, it was brutal. Yes, it was long hours, but what an enormous privilege to kind of be connected to that world, even just for a little time. And it does help you round out that education. I agree with that completely.
Yeah, it's one that I think a lot about, in that I look back now on some really inhumane experiences I had. And I use that term, with some inverted commas. They wouldn't pass modern standards. It was, don't worry, we'll have dinner on your desk at 8:00 at night. But to your point, that word of privilege, I was seeing things and working on things I couldn't, I still get value from and couldn't have imagined existed. Certainly weren't in any textbook. So it's a very, very interesting one, I think, particularly, given where you've ended up. So you go from the commercial law, into a commercial role. What were the commercial roles that you did?
Yeah, so I stepped into a listed automotive parts business, a classic Australian brand called Repco. At the time, their name's changed now. They still exist as a retail chain, but the corporate group was, at the time, had spun off from Pacific Dunlop and listed under a management buyout structure. So it was kind of that recently evolved company. And I went in as a legal counsel, but pretty quickly became kind of a corporate special projects, fix up problems type person. And again, that was brilliant experience working with a boss at the time who was incredible in his approach to being quite absent and letting me do whatever I needed to do, and specialised in that very light touch management approach, which I look back and think, well, I guess it forced me to make some decisions and learn some things as I went. But at the same time, we were then out in a listed corporate entity. We were very subject to those short-term financial cycles, and we were under a lot of pressure to perform as a business. So that was really educational for me in terms of really feeling that tension between how do you invest in the long-term growth of the business when you've got extreme financial market pressures to achieve results. That was probably my most significant learning experience through that time. And ultimately, that business was then delisted and bought back by private equity, and I had the good fortune to run that process. So we were sort of courted by a few different private equity houses, and eventually one bought the business out. And after that, I left the business at a time where I stepped into family business, which is another story. But that experience of really feeling the pressures that are operationally really fantastic brand, a lot of people, but were under intense pressures from financial markets was very educational for me. It was a great experience.
Great. So at that point, what sort of age were you at that point?
I would have been probably just past 30 or about 30.
About 5 years in the law, and then and then into a listed company as a general counsel or company secretary, or?
Yeah, both of those, and also I picked up various different jobs as people left. So I was in a few different operational sort of
running a bit of M&A and
yeah, correct. Had a little alteration with the ACCC at one stage, so was suddenly involved in a negotiation with the ACCC. It was a brilliant experience and some really great people that I connected with there.
So then off into a family business. What was that business, and what was that experience? What was your role?
Yeah, well, I think up until that point, I'd followed a pretty traditional path, Brett, and I know you're interested in this idea of how people end up where they end up, and I think that this is really where things took a bit of a turn for me. My father-in-law had actually become quite ill, and he'd had this long-standing finance company that he'd started in the 80s, and my wife was pretty heavily involved. She'd worked with her dad for years, and he became ill with a brain tumour, and the diagnosis was terminal. And so whilst I was still at Repco, I was doing a bit of work in the evenings just trying to help navigate this business. And then when he passed away, our first son was 6 weeks old at the time, and I was still very heavily involved in that transaction activity at Repco. So it took a few months, but eventually I left Repco to help my wife, who was trying to run this business with a young baby at home. It was a pretty hectic time of life. But that started off it's a classic family business story. I popped in to help for 6 months, and 10 years later came out the other end, or about 8 years later. And it was a finance company, but it was involved in quite complex litigation. And very strangely, it also had a golf course business as part of a sort of portfolio, which was an operating golf course down on the Mornington Peninsula. So I suddenly went from a sort of corporate role to running a small, complicated family business with quite a high risk proposition with all this litigation going on. And I think that's just the serendipity of sometimes you end up with some skill sets. So in my career and moving into a corporate role, I knew how to manage lawyers. So when you're an in-house counsel, you were often managing external lawyers. So that skill set was suddenly really relevant for this finance company that had quite a lot of litigation on the go and lots of lawyers engaged. I was no means an expert in litigation whatsoever, but I knew how to work with lawyers. So I stepped into that role and really took the next probably close to 5 years to wind up that portfolio. And when you're in complex litigation, there's only three outcomes. You either win, lose, or negotiate. And the vast majority we were negotiating to clean up, and eventually we wound up that finance company business. But at the same time, we had this golf course that was losing money at the time, and we had to figure out what to do with it. And so we invested in the marketing side, which is really where my wife has some great expertise. And we grew the business by being a little bit different to most traditional golf courses, really working with the public side of the business. And we built a wedding business and an events business out of this clubhouse that was not making any money otherwise. And we had a bit of success there in getting it to sort of a break-even proposition, which at the time was really challenging. And this is the kind of business that when something goes wrong, it's always a six-figure problem. The water ball collapses.
The roof falls in or that.
Correct. It was like it was a classic case of just when you start looking like you've had a good month, a piece of capital infrastructure goes wrong. So it was a brutal time, but it was a fantastic team of people, and we got it to break even and then eventually sold that business as well. So yeah, that was a journey, not only in terms of the businesses itself, but also managing a family business, which brings with it different dynamics and responsibilities.
So that took you about 5 years. So you're almost 40, couple of kids, another kid during the time, or?
Yeah, a couple of kids by that stage. And in fact, being in the golf industry presented other opportunities. So I ended up bringing some software in from the US that we had started to use to help market the golf business. And we became a distributor of that software to the Australian golf industry. That led to then working with a lot of local governments in some consulting work. So I went into partnership with another golf business professional, and we were helping local governments figure out what the heck to do with these public golf courses that they often have on their hands and don't know what to do with. Yeah. And there's a funny dynamic in local government. They'll spend $20, $25 million on a pool that will never make money. But they had these golf courses that did make money, and they had no desire to invest in them or do anything with them. So we were often trying to educate counsellors about the golf industry and what they should do. And then we started a trade show in the golf industry as well. So I sort of suddenly found myself starting businesses in the golf industry. And ultimately, I got a lot of joy out of that. It was a really fun time in life, but it was about 2018 where I sort of decided that the golf industry wasn't necessarily somewhere I'd planned to end up, and it was time for a change again. So I separated up with my business partner, and that went pretty well. We're still good friends, which is an achievement, I think, in business. And that's when I sort of found myself looking for something new.
So you come at B Lab or B Corp. How did you find the B Corp movement, and what is a B Corp, and what's all that about for people that are listening that don't know what a B Corp is?
Look, I think the best opportunities come. I think a lot of people like to look back and kind of rewrite history and tell you about the genius decisions they made, whereas the reality is so much of it is serendipity and often helped by just being open to talk to people. So when I left the golf industry, I spent probably 6 months just talking to people, just trying to figure out what else was out there, how were my skills potentially valued. And I came to understand that some of those skills were in being able to work with very different business structures. I'd worked with all sorts of different businesses and seen different perspectives and different industries. And I had a capacity to learn, I guess. Those conversations, particularly with a few different people in private equity and in accounting firms looking for help with businesses that were perhaps underperforming or needed help, led me to a conversation when an opportunity came up with B Lab. And I remember having a meeting with the chair, and she was just brilliant in terms of being really open to looking for people from a different background to help fix the sort of operational and business model of this small not-for-profit B Lab. And I was lucky enough to get the job. And look, B Lab is a small not-for-profit, but we are the group behind B Corporations. B Corporations are businesses like yours who are the highest performers in terms of social and environmental performance, who, in the old language, perhaps take an approach to triple bottom line, really thinking about their impact on the planet and people as well as profit. So we actually certify businesses. So B Corps are businesses that are certified to achieve very high standards of social and environmental performance, and we set those standards. So globally, we have an organisation that really defines standards or an architecture for how to run a business for positive impact. And I think for me, it was having that background in working across different sectors and that ability to see lots of different businesses that probably gave me some relevant experience to the role. And it's honestly been the most fun couple of years of my life, Brett. It's a brilliant job. I get to work with this group of about 320 B Corps across Australia and New Zealand that are some of the most interesting and high-performing businesses I've ever come across.
So it is a very interesting movement, and I came looking for a structured way of better differentiating our mindset around doing business in a way that was positive, because I believe that you just get a better outcome by doing things for the right reasons in the right way. And for a long time there really wasn't a structure or sort of an agreed way of thinking about those issues. And that's, I grabbed about a dozen books, I read them all, and I sort of followed down this path of blogs and websites until I found the B Corp book. And so for anyone listening, if you haven't read the book, you should read it. And if you haven't done some research, you should, in my view, have a look. It is my view that people want to do, employees want to be good employees, leaders want to be good leaders, golfers want to be better golfers. I think it's inherent in people to want to progress and be better at what they're doing. And there's the odd one who's going the other way, but I don't think that's true of human nature generally. So, I do think the world is moving to having a broader perspective on how life and business and your career can be more integrated in a positive way. And obviously B Corp's playing a great role in that. 320 businesses. Share with us a little bit, Andrew, I think it's Kathmandu, I think Ben & Jerry's, but some of the very famous businesses globally that have really led this movement, to give our listeners a sort of taste of, where this concept has really come from.
Sure. So, and first of all, I couldn't agree more. And very much comes down to this funny fellow called Milton Friedman, who wrote his essay 50 years ago that defined business to be really its primary role is to provide returns to shareholders. And I think that simplistic concept has done so much harm in the last 50 years and does, as you say, it just does not line up with human nature. People don't go to business every day or go to work every day thinking, yep, I really want to drive returns for shareholders today. They go looking for fulfillment, obviously their own income and returns for their efforts. They look for social connection, any number of factors. So this idea that business exists solely for that one purpose, I think is just an absolute farce, and quite frankly, gets wheeled out most often when I think CEOs or businesses are looking for some justification for why they did something that was probably completely unacceptable, rather than actually thinking itself is a good idea.
It's almost like a reflection of, if you think about how education's gone, once upon a time, Oxford and Cambridge, these places were places of broad learning. And I think it was the 18th century Germans, pioneered in education, deep sort of specialization. It was almost, it's almost like in the West, there's been a sort of collective lobotomy to break people down into, their brains down into very, individualized and specialized mindsets. You meet lawyers who know about law, but don't know anything about people. You meet people that are meant to know about politics, but haven't studied law. Or, you've got Dan Andrews currently in Melbourne, who appears to know something about politics, but little about, the long-term effect on an economy when you shut down businesses, what it is to be in a small business, to have a personal guarantee, to have mortgaged your home, and how difficult that might be to just start up again. So you see this sort of people who can't, we're not educating people to see more broadly. I think Milton Friedman was sort of a product of that, rather than giving him any credit as being a leader of anything. He was just a severe case of that psychosis, in my view. But, it found an audience because we'd sort of turned everyone into narrowly stupid rather than broadly wise.
Yeah, I love that concept of narrowly stupid. I think that to answer your question before that, sorry, I distracted us with Milton Friedman. The classic examples globally of businesses, as you said, like Ben & Jerry's, Patagonia is probably one of the world's best known businesses that by its own statements is in business to save a home planet, is their catchline. And this idea of these really powerful brands, they're the best known ones, but the B Corp movement started off with smaller businesses, exactly people like you, Rhett, who were looking for an architecture or a way to really attach their business to the values that they held. But then also it's very human to look for a tribe as well, to look for other people who have the same values and thinking about why we should be in business. And in Australia, the story is the same. It started off with smaller businesses before some of the larger ones, like Australian Ethical, came on fairly early on in the process. And recently, we've certainly picked up some much bigger businesses, like, as you said, Kathmandu in New Zealand. Synlait, which is a dairy or milk nutrition company, is now currently our biggest. In recent years, we've had a lot of interest from financial institutions. So we've got organisations like Beyond Bank Australia, and Bank Australia recently was certified last year. Not surprising to me that financial institutions have also been coming on board in the last few years, as I think that industry, through the Royal Commission, went through a pretty challenging period. And a lot of people are asking, well, what does a good financial institution look like? And of course, there are lots of great financial institutions out there. They're not all sort of big banks doing harm. And in fact, a lot of the big banks do a lot of great work as well. So I think organisations come to B Corp often looking to position themselves differently, to really test themselves to a set of standards, but then also use that certification to be able to show people that they are different businesses. So to me, it's
a nice comment, Andrew, on architecture, to give some shape to good intentions.
And that's probably one of the key things that people might not understand. So people understand certifications. They know fair trade or organic, and they know instinctively that organic tells you something about how a product, usually some produce, has been grown. It's about chemicals and the way that the approach, if you like, or the philosophy to farming has got that product. What you don't know anything about is the supply chain or the value chain that has delivered that product to you. So B Corp is holistic. So if you're working with a certified B Corporation or working for one or buying something from one, it speaks to the entirety of that business. And that's where the architecture comes in. The standards actually measure the performance across 5 key criteria. So we look at the governance of a business. We look at its relationship to its customers, so its business model. We look at how it impacts its community. and its workers, so its employee and employment arrangements. And then the last one we look at is its environmental footprint. So that is a holistic capture of a business's structures and design. And what it presents to a business is that architecture. So you can use the standards to benchmark and measure yourself. And all businesses do some things really well, and all businesses have areas that they can improve in. And that's where I think the best people in business approach it with a sense of, I want to see how I stack up, but I also want to see where I can do better, because I know there's going to be some areas that I just haven't thought about. And I think when you come to it with that approach, that's when the certification really delivers value back to businesses.
Yeah, very cool. I'm just making notes here, Andrew, which I tend to do. So this idea that an architecture that gives, business leaders a shape to think about their business more holistically, I think, is great in terms of trying to cure the Friedman-esque narrowness, and then, give people a certification, or at least a certification to aspire to give them a sense of progress and a way to feel that they can move forward, which is great. And then to your comment around tribe, which I think is so important, often people are out there, they've got, I see with the businesses we work with, they've got ideas to do things well. They don't have time to write their own certification, build their own standards, and as well as raise their couple of kids or a dozen kids or whatever it might be. And then, so you guys are providing that as well. And then I think, what is most interesting in life and business, Warren Buffett, who's a great hero of mine, says, if I can give you one tip, that's to hang around people that are better than you, and hope that some of their goals, some of their gold rubs off. I've written 4 books of interviews. I do the podcast, and often I'm asked, well, why do you do that? It's that theory that if you can get around people that are better than you in whatever respect, then everyone has something to learn from someone. Earlier, you made this comment, you feel like your path has been very much informed by your capacity to learn. I think it's, virtually the key career skill and virtually the key life skill is that capacity to learn new things and change and evolve. How do you see B Corp as evolving over time to keep, to keep filling out, I guess, that mission for positive impact?
Such a great question. And there's 2 ways to answer that. One is to give you the sort of quick explanation of literally how the standards evolve, and they evolve every 3 years. We have a global standards advisory council that is made up of both experts and industry representation, and then we have subgroups that are geographically aligned that are designed to bring that maximum lens of lots of input into the standards. And every 3 years is an official new version, and every 3 years, every B Corp has to go through a recertification process. So by definition, you will be sitting a different assessment next time you get put through the ringer. And it is a ringer, as you well know. It's a very challenging process. So that's literally how they evolve. But I think there's a larger question there that you're posing. And, one of the challenges that we're grappling with at the moment, for instance, is that the way the architecture works is that it rewards points for how you're aligned to it. And there's various algorithms behind the scenes that weight it according to different industries and sectors, of course. But it doesn't take points away. So this is not the ethical investing screen that a lot of investors work with is typically around some rules that says we won't invest in fossil fuels, but we will do that. B Corp doesn't quite work that way, although we do have some particular controversial industry approaches. But generally speaking, we don't look over your business and say, well, we're going to take 3 points away for that because we don't like that. It's about awarding positive points for the way that you're organised to have positive impact. So there's a really interesting debate around, well, should there actually be some mandatory minimums? Should we actually say that no one can be a B Corp unless you've maybe made a net zero 2050 commitment? And that's a really live debate at the moment. But it's a great example to think about, well, businesses can make that commitment pretty easily. But the real question is, what are they doing to achieve it? So you've got to be really careful in setting standards.
And interestingly, Andrew, for some businesses like ours, I joked with somebody the other day that, I hope to be net zero today, and if not today, tomorrow. But to be fair, I don't own any mines.
Yes.
nor power stations. So it's relatively easier to make that commitment if you're me. Yeah, I think this approach of taking people on a journey and letting them move at some pace without hectoring them is a new approach for some people, but I think a positive one.
Yeah, and look, it's such an important point you make. AGL in Victoria is our single biggest emitter as a company. And it's easy to then sort of wag your finger and say, well, that must mean AGL's a terrible business. Well, of course not. In fact, AGL's got some really powerful commitments to renewable energy. It just so happens that they're responsible for the primary power generation in this state, which is brown coal electricity. And we all rely on
it's a big job no matter which way you go about it.
Correct. But the point is not to say, therefore, they're a bad business. The point is to say, well, actually, our reliance on coal-fired power in Victoria is not AGL's fault. It's an infrastructure, a historical legacy that has happened over time. It's our collective responsibility to think about how we can solve that. It's no one company's responsibility. So I think that sense of collectivism is also really important for informing the standards as they evolve over time. It's not just simply looking at how can my business be better, but how can the system be better? How can we change the system? And ultimately, that's what we are literally here for at B Lab. We are trying to change the economic system. We're trying to make sure that the economic system builds community and regenerates the environment, opposed to the opposite, which is often the case where business extracts from the community and damages the environment. We've seen that countless times. So I think that the idea of evolving the standards is also heavily informed by the businesses that get on board. You cannot, whilst on the one hand they're objective and we hold you to these standards, at the same time we have to recognise that there are businesses innovating all the time that are often well ahead of the curve and doing things that we haven't mapped yet. We haven't recognised our great impact. And I think that's also one of the challenges of running an objective standards-based organisation, is that we wish that we could evolve the standards daily as we come across great new businesses and redesign the whole system. But the value of certification is that at the same time, we're holding you to these objective standards that are structured. And certainly some businesses will come to B Corp and say, well, you know what, I don't align with those standards and I think I'm a great business. And I say all power to you. But it is a very effective way for you to also look at those other areas of your business that you may not be performing as well in because you simply haven't turned your mind to them.
And think about them. So it's an interesting one, Andrew. Like, I guess, one of my pet projects is thinking. And when I look at this, the world we're in right now, we've got an objective standards-based organization in, certainly since, I think the power behind Friedman's narrow mindset was largely sort of the kerosene for that thinking was a post-objective standards world. So, if you think about the major philosophical movements that we've seen since the 60s, certainly postmodernism allows you to move away from objective standards that were once culturally quite well accepted to a place where it was like my truth, your truth, they're different things. How do you operate an objective standards organization in a post-truth world?
Boy, you're asking the tough ones, Brett. I think it's again a question of diversity of perspective is always going to be high up the list there. So not believing that you have the right answer and being open to others. And I think that's almost the source code error in our thinking at the moment on so many levels is this tendency we have to simply build a wall around our own views and self-righteousness. And we see that play out in politics increasingly, where there's this inability to kind of work across the aisle. I think that a good example of one of those norms is things like mass layoffs in large companies. They were never a lever that companies pulled until about the mid-70s, I think. It simply wasn't done. Companies didn't sack 6,000 people to ensure that they still met this year's financial metrics. They would dip in their performance for a period of time. And I think the financial system is a huge player here that we also need to be really focused on in understanding, again, not simply putting labels on people and saying, well, they're a bad business person or an evil business person, but what are the influences on that person that is leading that person to make that decision? I think it's about seeing the best in people, not seeing the worst in people, and understanding that we're all creatures of multiple influences. And it's a bit cheesy perhaps, but seeing the best in people is not popular right now. We tend to be much faster to tear people down and think, well, maybe that person is really well intentioned, but they've got a flaw in their system, or they've got a blind spot that they're not thinking through. How can we help them get past that, as opposed to
or a different, totally, or just a different constituency? Like to your earlier comment, when you're working at Repco, working within a structure that had particular pressures, when you're within that system, it's, I'm certain that the senior management team within that system didn't go to work every day to be naughty people, but they were working within a structure. And I think so often when people look at, it's easy to look at our politicians and think, well, who couldn't do a better job, or to look at the CEO of a listed company and think, well, who couldn't do a better job, or people in these different, big social, running a union or a big hospital, or any of these things are their own ecosystems with their own historical thought processes and the structures that come from that. So they're not that easy to turn on a 5-cent piece in a moment.
And I think there's another part of that too, Rep, which is about that diversity of perspective. Are we listening to voices that might introduce us to some thinking that we don't have? This idea that we tend to all live in our own bubbles, and they're creatures of how and where we grew up and who we work with. And you sometimes have to make a real effort to break out of that. It's a challenge that we should all embrace, because the number of times when you do genuinely open yourself to a different perspective, it just shocks you into realising that there's some value somewhere you haven't thought of. And I think that kind of that hero leadership concept is an interesting trap for people who are in positions of leadership. This idea that because I'm a leader, I'm expected to have the answers. I'm expected to be the final decision on everything. It's a real trap, and I fall into it time and time again. I think, well, I have to be the one that works the hardest and takes on the problems. And this sort of slightly more contemporary idea of leading from the middle requires you to really let that hero leadership go. Leading from the middle is a fascinating concept that I'm trying to learn a lot more about.
Yeah, I think the devil owns the fence. There is no middle, but the people at the bottom generally, in other people's minds, the newest people, the most junior people, the people with the least experience, often have the least caked on sort of invested positions in an organization. And if they feel that their voice, that their opinion matters, or that somebody really wants to hear what they think and encourages them to, you often really get out of the box perspectives from people that just aren't invested in the status quo. I'm very interested in, what leadership means to people, what they really value from their leaders, and who are those that are most effective. It's really quite interesting.
And I think a good way to link that to sort of management of business is this contemporary idea of purpose. So it's a bit of a buzzword, purpose or impact, is another frame of reference that people are using. But I think that we're seeing business leaders who can articulate a purpose for their business are the ones that are increasingly doing well. And that purpose does not always have to be a huge fundamental solution to a world problem. But articulating your business towards a higher level purpose is exactly how you engage with a wider audience of people. Being the best at something, being the fastest growing at something, it might be nice for your financial stakeholders, but it's pretty meaningless when you actually strip it down. You say, so what? What's the so what factor at the end of that sentence when you are the biggest or the best? And when you articulate a purpose, the so what immediately follows. Well, if I'm the biggest, I'm going to have the biggest impact because of this real focus I've got on solving a particular problem. And that is where I think the modern workplace is massively changing, where increasingly people who work for businesses expect them to be doing more than simply beating the business down the road or generating the most returns.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It just feels like that old song, everything old is new again, Andrew, in that these great organizations that exist around the world, it was obvious that they were founded with deep purpose. Whether in the social sphere or in the business sphere, they had a clear mission. There was a reason that they existed, a problem that they sort of came to solve. Over time, and I do sort of trace it to sort of the changes in the 60s, 70s, and then culminating really in the 80s, that heavier historical values were sort of washed away with the chase for a dollar. But it's interesting that over the cycle now, 40 years post sort of the the NIDA of the 80s stock market crash, that it does feel like there is a genuine search for meaning, which is, is being driven by societies where more people have more stuff than ever before. And so, it has, in terms of a Maslow's hierarchy, it does seem to have been forcing people up the hierarchy to think about, well, after you've got all the stuff, what do you do with it? Why does it matter?
Yeah, and I think there's a growing awareness that inequality has a price. And we tend to, especially in the American ideal of capitalism, think that what capitalism does best is really motivate people to innovate and drive themselves because they're motivated by that financial return that follows. And I wouldn't argue with that in principle, but again, it's lacking the wider lens to actually think about what drives people, and linking that idea of or focusing too narrowly on the important power of capitalism to drive innovation. And we haven't found a better system, so let's go with it. We also need to think about that alternate perspective of what's the consequence to that on a macro level. And we know that rising inequality destabilizes economies, causes social problems that in turn destabilizes the ability of businesses to operate. And if you're truly interested in that capitalism ideal, you can't stop your thinking at that narrow sort of, well, capitalism's great because it provides the right incentive structure. You have to square the circle, so to speak. You have to keep going and say, well, provided the system it's self-sustainable. And I think that's what we're coming up against. We're seeing most clearly environmentally that we are hitting some limits that need to be responded to. And again, the debate around belief just horrifies me, because you're seeing good businesses take real action because they recognise, I think, that systemic problem. You need a robust, sustainable system in order to achieve that capitalism, that capitalist ideal. So I think that inequality is, along with climate change, is the other big driver there that we're starting to see. When there's too much inequality, the system gets destabilised, and that's not a good thing for anybody. That's if you're unwilling to look at it on a very human level as well, of course, where rising inequality has a terrible price.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think it's true. I do tend to think that the climate change religion lacks a personal dimension. And so when a young person comes and talks to me about climate change, I ask them to hand over their iPhone, make a personal commitment. That's not something that they're very keen to do. So it can easily become a movement that pushes, the responsibility for that change off to someone else. I look at the biggest cost of Milton Friedman's, narrowness as being the destruction of families in society. And so the Western family tree has been inverted. We can't even produce the next generation. And most families struggle to live in a way that is healthy for them or their children because of the pressures of the system within which they live. And when you look at it, inequality in the US, certainly in underprivileged communities where their families have been destroyed, it's the driver of that long-term inequality. Broken families, no parents, no stability, no access to education. You close the schools for COVID, and it's really, kids in minority communities, single parents, no access to the internet, can't go to school, no mum, no dad, grandparents. I think that's I see the inequality, I see the climate change, but I see the destruction of the family as being really the thing that's most damaged our modern communities. And as a leader in a business, trying to run a business in a way that says, hey, we want people first to be healthy. So that, that has to mean their own physical health, their own mental health, the health of their families. And then, you want them to be wealthy in the sense that to be able to provide at least for their needs and hopefully some of their wants. And then hopefully, I think, as you've really alluded to here, some wisdom about closing the circle and looking beyond the next second to saying, well, what is the long-term impact of that pattern of life or that pattern of production or that pattern of treating your people? I think so interesting. Andrew, I so want to thank you for your time today. And I really want to, commend the B Lab movement and B Corp movement operated by B Lab as a way of challenging you to think, because thinking's never a bad thing, to give you an architecture that's broader than. And I think, guys, in the certification process that we think it really challenged us. We work with Andrew and his team to think, how can we, to Andrew's term, sort of round off that circle and make something genuinely sustainable. Gives you a certification that gives you a sense of progress, which I think is so important. And I do think is often in capitalism being replaced simply by progress in terms of dollars rather than in a broader sense. And then gives you a tribe, a group of people that are similarly trying to learn and progress and do things better. I've found the guys to be very open-minded and very genuine. I think you can hear in Andrew's story today, this is a guy who's come with an amazing background. I think your personal journey, Andrew, is really inspiring. And, I think I look forward to a long relationship with B Lab and Kelly+Partners. And really hope that anyone who's heard today is, there's so much to this topic that, you could put 40 people on this call. You could do it for 40 hours. You wouldn't have even scratched the surface, because you're really operating a level of the depth and breadth of human capacity. And I always love to say, I think there's so much in all of us that there's a huge opportunity to get out there and make the world a better place. So, Andrew, thank you so much for your time. Keep up the great work. And I'd love to have you back again with one of your B Corp businesses and talk about their journey to certification, what it's meant over a number of years, so that we can give another working example for our listeners.
Yeah, look, it'd be a pleasure, Brett, and it's a big congratulations to Kelly+Partners, because getting a listed business across the line is very challenging. The bigger and more complex a business is generally, of course, the harder it's going to be. But I think I'd love to tell some of those stories. We've got some B Corps in the community across Australia and New Zealand doing incredible work. Many of your listeners will have seen a business like Who Gives a Crap that really led in those strange toilet paper shortages with some really heart-led responses, encouraging kindness and support at a time when many businesses just would have said, I've got an in-demand product, so it's going to be a great quarter. So look, those stories are the best stories, the people behind the B Corp movement, the people who run these businesses, who take on this extra standard, which they do not have to do. They're the people who I'm just blown away by every day. And it's such a privilege to get to work with this community. So I'd love to bring more of those perspectives, and thanks so much for your time.
Awesome. Andrew, as I love to say, have a great day.
Thanks, Brett. Same to you.
Thanks for listening to the Be Better Off Show. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to rate and review on Apple Podcasts.
Have a great day.